Everyone feared the millionaire, until the new waitress humiliated him in front of everyone. This is the story that took place in New York, in a restaurant where luxury and fear walked side by side. Imagine a man so powerful that his mere presence made the air heavy, as if every glance had to be lowered before him. Now imagine someone who had never heard of this power, a young woman who arrived with simple dreams and naive courage, unaware that she was about to challenge someone everyone avoided. What happens when innocence meets arrogance? And how can one sentence topple an empire of fear? Stay with me until the end, because what you'll discover may change the way you view power and courage. Subscribe to the channel, like and comment here about what you would do in this situation. His name was Richard Coleman, a man who seemed to carry all of New York on his shoulders, not because of the weight of his work, but because of the dominance he exerted over those around him. He owned businesses, real estate, investments, and more than that, he owned silence. When Richard walked into a place, conversations dwindled, smiles faded, and even the most experienced waiters felt a cold sweat run down their palms. It was as if a ghost of authority hovered in the air, suffocating any courage. But what made Richard so feared wasn't just his wealth. There was something darker, almost invisible. He had a cruel habit of testing boundaries. He enjoyed provoking, humiliating, and turning simple moments into spectacles of power. If a waiter got his order wrong, he would correct it loudly, not to be served, but to be feared. If a customer got too close, Richard would remind them with a cold stare that they were on a different level. And everyone, without exception, bowed to his game. It was common to hear stories about him behind the scenes. Employees whispered that Richard had made young people quit their jobs in a matter of hours, simply with his arrogant way of asking for a glass of wine. Some swore he enjoyed watching others cower before him. To many, he wasn't just a millionaire. He was like an uncrowned king, an invisible emperor who ruled by fear. And the most intriguing thing is that, despite all this, Richard was never confronted. As if the entire city had accepted that his arrogance was part of the natural order of things. No one dared question it. No one dared confront him. It was as if New York had learned to live under the shadow of a man who believed himself untouchable. But fate, capricious as ever, does not bow to inflated egos. Because as much as Richard believed he controlled the environment, that he had people in his hands, there was something he could not foresee. The entrance of someone who did not know his rules. Someone who had no fear of his name, nor reverence for his power. A young woman who carried only the courage of innocence and the firmness of honesty. And it is precisely here that the atmosphere of this story begins to change. Because when collective fear finds a single voice willing to break the silence, the empire of power begins to tremble. La Belle Maison restaurant was one of the most sought after in Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like suspended jewels, reflecting golden light onto impeccably set tables. The aroma of sophisticated dishes mingled with the soft sound of a piano in the background. But there was something that jarred with this perfection, the sudden silence whenever Richard Coleman walked through the door. It was striking how the atmosphere changed in a matter of seconds. The older waiters hurried to straighten their uniforms, like soldiers about to face a general. Wealthy customers, accustomed to showing off, lowered their voices, fearful of attracting unwanted attention. It was as if a heavy cloud had descended upon the room, suffocating the lightness a dinner should have. Richard didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His cold, almost cutting gaze did more than any words. When he sat at his usual table, a secluded corner from which he could observe everything, it felt as if no one else had the right to shine. The restaurant, once a stage for laughter and clinking glasses, became a scene dominated by his presence. Stories circulated among the staff, almost like urban legends. A waiter named Michael once forgot to bring Richard's favorite wine at the exact temperature. The millionaire not only complained, but also loudly described the young man's incompetence until Michael quit that very night. Another anecdote involved a hostess who accidentally offered a dimly lit table. Richard made her cry in front of everyone with just short, sharp remarks. This was the cruelest portrait. It wasn't his money that made him feared, but the way he manipulated emotions, stripping people of their dignity before silent audiences. It was almost a spectacle of humiliation that was repeated night after night at La Belle Maison, and the most disturbing thing was that no one reacted. Some considered protesting, defending their colleagues, but all it took was a glance at Richard for any impulse to vanish. It was as if everyone was hypnotized, trapped in an invisible web of collective fear. But here's the great irony. The stronger the silence, the more explosive the sound of the first voice that dares to break it. And in that restaurant, on an ordinary autumn evening, that voice wouldn't come from a powerful customer, nor from a seasoned employee. It would come from someone who didn't know they should be afraid. A young woman with a curious gaze and steady hands newly joined the team, and this is where the story gains momentum. Because while Richard felt in absolute control, fate was already preparing its biggest surprise. Her name was Emily Carter. She was just 22 years old, fresh from upstate New York, carrying more dreams than clothes in her suitcase. Emily wasn't looking for luxury, nor was she looking for fame. What she wanted was simple, an opportunity. And so, after sending out resumes to dozens of places, she landed a job as a waitress at La Belle Maison. That first week on the job, everything was new. The glittering chandeliers, the exquisite dishes, the diners dressed as if they were walking a red carpet. To Emily, it seemed like another world. But unlike many of her colleagues, she wasn't afraid to make mistakes. Sure, she was cautious, observing everything carefully, but there was an innocence mixed with courage in her manner that drew attention. While the other waiters walked tensely, almost tripping over their nerves, Emily moved naturally. Perhaps because she wasn't yet aware of Richard Coleman's fame. Perhaps because her mind was occupied with other concerns, like sending part of her salary to help her sick mother in the countryside. To her, a customer was just a customer. No one deserved to be treated like a god just because they had money. Her colleagues whispered behind the scenes, "She doesn't know what awaits her yet." The tone wasn't one of envy, but of compassion. Everyone seemed to anticipate the inevitable clash between this fearless young woman and the man who enjoyed crushing any spark of daring. Emily had something Richard didn't understand: authenticity. He didn't wear masks. He didn't calculate every word. If something was wrong, she said so. If someone treated her badly, she wouldn't flinch. Not because I was arrogant, but because I believed respect was a two-way street, and it was precisely this essence that, without her realizing it, put her in Richard's path. While everyone was ready to bow before him, Emily didn't even know she should bow her head. On the night the two finally met, the restaurant dining room was packed. The piano played softly, glasses clinked, and the air had that invisible weight that always announced Richard's presence. Emily, busy with trays and orders, didn't notice the aura of silence that accompanied him. To her, he was just another customer sitting at a table like any other, but for everyone else, that was the scene that preceded a disaster, and it was in this contrast between collective fear and Emily's courageous innocence that the story took a turn that no one would have dared to predict. It was a Friday night at La Belle Maison. The restaurant was bustling with businessmen, socialites, and wealthy tourists seeking a taste of New York luxury. The piano played a slow melody, but not even the music could soften the tension that gripped the room when Richard Coleman entered. As always, glances averted, murmurs faded, and the room fell silent. Richard walked to his usual table, accompanied by two shadowy assistants. He sat with the imposing presence of someone who believed the world revolved around him. With the menu open, he didn't read, he dictated. His voice, deep and sharp, sounded more like decrees than requests. Emily, tray firmly in hand, was assigned to serve him that night. Her colleagues watched her silently, as if watching a show about to have a tragic ending. Some tried to warn her with glances, others muttered among themselves, "Poor newbie, you have no idea who he is." When she arrived at the table, Emily smiled as naturally as she would any other customer. "Good evening, sir. What would you like to drink?" Richard looked up slowly, scrutinizing her as if she were an auction piece. Then he gave a half-smile filled with disdain. "Bordeaux wine, 92 vintage. I want it at the exact temperature." The demand would have made any other waiter tremble, but Emily simply nodded, calmly writing it down. Turning around, she heard Richard add loudly, for all to hear, "I hope at least you're not as incompetent as the others here." The comment cut through the air like a blade. The nearby customers lowered their eyes in embarrassment, while the waiters paused for a moment, almost holding their breath. It was the beginning of another humiliating spectacle. Emily, however, showed no fear. She looked back at Richard, her brown eyes steady as if she were unwilling to be provoked. "Sir, I will do my best to fulfill your request exactly as you desire. But I believe that respect is more delicious than any wine." The entire room seemed to freeze. The piano sound stopped making sense. The glasses froze in the customer's hands, and for a second, everyone believed they had misheard. No one had ever answered Richard that way. The assistants beside him shifted in their seats, ready to intervene, but Richard merely raised an eyebrow in surprise. Emily, serene, stood her ground. The tension was palpable. It was like watching a silent duel in the middle of a restaurant. And in that moment, it became clear that this young woman was not like the others, and that was just the beginning of a night that would change everything. The silence that fell over the restaurant after Emily's response was almost unbearable. People looked at each other, trying to confirm if they had actually heard what they thought they had. A new waitress had just confronted Richard Coleman, the man everyone feared. It was like watching lightning strike the sky on a cloudless night. Unexpected, impossible, but real. Richard, accustomed to dictating the rules of the game, took a few seconds to react. His superior smile faded for a moment, revealing surprise, an expression very few had seen. But he quickly regained his composure, straightened his shoulders and leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to squash an insolent ant. "Repeat what you said," he murmured, his tone low, but so full of menace that it made the nearest customers hold their breath. Emily, however, didn't back down. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained firm. "I said that respect is tastier than any wine, sir." A murmur swept through the room like a wave. Some people widened their eyes, others pressed their lips together, as if trying to keep themselves from smiling. And Richard, for the first time in a long time, found himself facing someone who didn't bow to his empire of fear. He tried to fight back. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he asked, his voice now louder, echoing through the room. "With a client," Emily replied without hesitation, "and all clients deserve to be treated politely, but none have the right to humiliate anyone who works here." The words fell like hammer blows. There was no irony, no mockery, just a simple, raw and direct truth. It was precisely this simplicity that made the impact devastating. Some customers looked away in embarrassment, but others secretly felt a quiet courage. It was as if Emily had said out loud what everyone had always wanted to shout, but never had the strength to say. Richard took a deep breath, trying to regain control. His assistants leaned in to whisper something, but he held up his hand, stopping them. Though his face remained impassive, his eyes betrayed the pent-up fury. It wasn't just the young woman's response that hurt him, but the fact that she had broken the established order, the order he himself had created. The room, at that moment, seemed divided between fear and admiration. Some expected to see Emily fired on the spot, expelled like so many others before her. But there were also those who felt like applauding. What no one could deny was that she had achieved the impossible, silencing the millionaire. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and gave Emily an icy glare. "You have courage," he said, his tone measured. Or maybe just stupidity. Emily didn't answer. She just stared at him for a few seconds before turning and heading into the kitchen, as casually as she would have served any other customer. It was as if I'd just weathered a hurricane and still had my feet firmly on the ground, And it was in this simplicity that Richard's true humiliation lay. Accustomed to seeing everyone cower before his arrogance, he was reduced to silence by a young woman who was unfazed. There was no shouting, no physical confrontation, just the force of a sentence that exposed the fragility hidden behind his power. At that moment, everyone in the restaurant realized the reign of fear was not as invincible as it seemed. One voice was enough to break the spell, but what came next would be even more surprising. Because wounded in his pride, Richard wasn't about to let it go. And the night, already unforgettable, still held a twist no one dared imagine. Richard Coleman wasn't a man accustomed to losing. His entire life had been built on dominance, on the ability to instill fear even before words were used. Being silenced by a young waitress in front of dozens of people hurt not only his ego, but also the very image he cultivated. And precisely because of this, the entire restaurant awaited his reaction with racing hearts. Some clients were betting on a scandal. Others expected Emily to be immediately expelled, perhaps even further humiliated. The employees trembled at the mere thought of the consequences of such audacity. But to everyone's surprise, Richard did nothing of the sort. He remained seated, motionless, like a marble statue. His cold eyes observed every detail of the waitress as she calmly walked back to the kitchen. Inside, it was as if a fire was burning silently. On the outside, however, his body betrayed nothing of the anger he felt. It was in this contrast that the twist arose. Instead of exploding, Richard did something no one expected. He smiled. A slow, enigmatic smile, as if he'd encountered a riddle for the first time in his life. And then he murmured, low enough for only his assistants to hear, "Interesting." Very interesting. The tension in the room didn't lessen. On the contrary, it increased. The silence was now not just one of fear, but of bewilderment. What did that smile mean? What would he do next? Emily returned to the table with the bottle of wine at just the right temperature. She poured the glass with steady hands, never looking away. Richard watched her silently, and when she finished, he lifted the glass, examining the liquid in the light of the chandelier. Then he took a slow sip and, without anyone believing it, said, "Perfect." People barely reacted. It was as if they couldn't process what was happening. Richard, the same man who had already ruined careers with a single sentence, praising a waitress who had just stood up to him. It sounded like a bad joke. But Richard didn't stop there. He looked directly at Emily and added, "You have more courage than everyone in this room combined." The shock was widespread. Some customers opened their mouths discreetly, others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The employees looked at each other, trying to figure out if this was a disguised threat or genuine recognition. Emily, for her part, remained calm. She didn't smile, didn't thank them. She simply replied, "I just did what anyone should do," and it was this sentence that once again disarmed Richard. Because in his mind, he was accustomed to manipulating others. But with this young woman, there was no room for his games. He realized, perhaps for the first time in decades, that he didn't have absolute control. The mood in the restaurant changed. Fear gave way to a strange sense of hope. It was as if everyone realized that Richard's empire had cracks, that his authority was not indestructible. All it took was courage to face him. Still, no one knew what would come next. Would he be able to swallow his pride and move on? Or was he just biding his time to exact revenge? The only certainty was that Richard Coleman didn't emerge victorious that night. And although he hadn't been outright defeated, everyone knew something had changed forever, and this change would be even clearer in the impact that scene would have on everyone present. The silence that fell over La Belle Maison after Richard Coleman's praise was unlike any other silence the restaurant had ever known. It wasn't fear, nor was it tension. It was a silence of admiration, mixed with disbelief. Employees looked at each other, some still trembling, trying to process what they had witnessed. The young newcomer, who had arrived just days earlier, shy and insecure, had changed the atmosphere of a place dominated by fear. Michael, the veteran waiter who'd been humiliated by Richard himself on other occasions, watched Emily with watchful eyes. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Perhaps it wasn't necessary to bow to absolute power. Perhaps there was a way to work with dignity, even in the face of arrogant and controlling people. Customers also reacted subtly but powerfully. Some gave Emily discreet looks of approval, while others murmured among themselves, admiring the young woman's courage. Some, experienced in the business world and having faced difficult bosses, recognized the gesture as something rare and precious, the power of honesty and authenticity. Meanwhile, Emily continued her work with her usual naturalness. Every dish delivered, every detail observed, now carried an aura of confidence that hadn't existed before. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, and at the same time, she had proven something to everyone, that a courageous and just attitude can shake even the most solid empire of arrogance. The impact of her actions wasn't limited to that night. In the following days, her co-workers began to view Richard differently. Many felt inspired to act more decisively in the face of injustice. Some even began to question behaviors they had previously passively accepted. And among customers, Emily's story spread quickly. Some returned to the restaurant just to witness the waitress who dared to confront the feared millionaire. It was as if she had opened an invisible door, showing that courage and respect can coexist, and more than that, can transform an entire environment. The night was over, but the consequences continued. Richard, accustomed to controlling everyone around him, had to face a reality he was unaccustomed to accepting. That absolute power does not exist when someone finds the courage to face it. And as everyone reflected on what they had witnessed, a question hung in the air. Would that simple action by Emily change just that one night? Or would it forever transform the way fear and respect coexist? If this story has touched you so far, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you would do if you were in Emily's shoes. Because one person's courage can indeed inspire many others. The night wore on, and the dining room at La Belle Maison slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But nothing would be the same. Each step Richard Coleman took toward the exit carried a heavy silence, unlike his usual fear. There was a mixture of restrained respect and bewilderment. That night would mark a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed what had happened. Richard paused for a moment in front of the door, taking a deep breath. It was as if he were absorbing every detail of the night, every reaction, every look. The power that had once been absolute now seemed fragile, almost human. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to humiliate anyone. None of that defined his authority anymore. For a brief moment, Richard realized that true strength isn't measured by the fear you impose, but by the respect you earn. Emily continued to set tables and serve food, maintaining her characteristic calm and naturalness. For her, everything was going as it should, but for everyone around her, her act of courage had left an indelible mark. The rookie waitress had shown that dignity and firmness can transform even the most oppressive environment. Some customers applauded discreetly, others exchanged looks of approval. More experienced employees smiled inwardly, feeling inspired by the attitude of someone they barely knew just days before. Michael, the veteran waiter, took a deep breath and quietly commented to a colleague, "I never imagined I would see Richard Coleman unable to instill fear." And yet everything was resolved with respect. Richard, for his part, left without looking back. A simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. He left the hall not defeated, but transformed. He was no longer the man everyone feared. He was someone who had just learned, the hard way, that power does not equal absolute respect. And at that moment, the story reached its climax. The young waitress, with courage and determination, had changed the dynamics of an entire place, showing that a single action can have a profound impact on many lives. The silence that had previously suffocated now became silent reverence, not out of fear, but through the power of truth. As Emily continued her work, the audience felt the weight of the lesson. Courage, honesty, and authenticity can be more powerful than any fortune. And you, who have watched this story thus far, have realized that one person's strength can indeed transform the world around them. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you would do if you were in Emily's shoes. Because one person's courage, even seemingly small, can resonate far beyond what we imagine.